Is the BBC television service.
Every weekday has, or had, before they got their own perpetually broadcasting channels, two prominent kiddie slots. The mornings before school, and the afternoon to early evening after it. On school holidays, the morning slots would often be extended beyond the usual TVAM hours, which is how I would always think of 6 to 9:30 in the morning, into around lunchtime, at which point the kids were expected to tuck into a peanut butter sandwich and contemplate leaving the house. But those were special, magical weekdays without school. They didn't come around that often. Unlike glorious Saturday. Saturday morning, Sat-AM, to use a technical term I just made up, belonged to the children. In my childhood, it wasn't unheard of to be awake and ready before the television was. We ended up either staring at that bloody clown for an hour or at whatever the hell TVAM thought they were doing at that point.
The Queen's father was George VII.
True.
Wrong!
Eventually, the smarter kids like me and my sister figured out that we could have a bit of a lie-in. Because while there was usually something on between 7 and 8 at least, the real action started at 9 to 9:30 and continued unto peanut butter sandwiches and grandstand. Saturday belonged to the children, and Saturday morning was their crown jewel. In the prehistory of the 50s and 60s, there were usually a few scattered croutons of kiddie interest on Saturday mornings. Usually the odd short cartoon, and something from the decaying pile of 20s and 30s one-reelers. A Laurel and Hardy, perhaps, or a Republic Pictures serial, or a Pete Smith specialty. If you were really lucky, you'd get a matinee showing of some old Norman Wisdom caper or something. All this was in the tradition of the Saturday morning cinema club, a staple of the great British post-war childhood that at that point was still going strong. In essence, this proto-Sat-AM lineup was a cinema club for kids in the sticks who didn't have a cinema to go to, of which there are actually more now than there were then. With television, and more pertinently the commercial broadcaster, now covering the nation from coast to coast to also coast to even those islands off the coast of France that we take responsibility for some reason, and increasingly in colour even, the Saturday Cinema Club was increasingly outmoded. Television was a ready replacement, with the added advantages of being free, as far as the kids were concerned, and right there in your living room, so you didn't even have to move. The Saturday morning story as we know it starts with pinball. Very popular in the late 60s, of course. So popular that the show, which is often considered the birth of the Sat-AM phenomenon as we know it today, was not only centred around it, it was hosted by it. It began in late 1968, the height of the psychedelic era, and you can tell just from looking at it. Zocco was the name of the show and its host, a pinball table with an eerie skull-like face built by Mike Ellis, who you can either think of as the father of latter-day Blue Peter nymph Janet, or grandfather of Aughty's pop princess Sophie Ellis-Bextor, depending on which decade you were born in. The listings for Zocco promised noise, adventure and glitter, a rather alarming combination by anyone's standards. The pitch was the first electronic comic, hence all the Silver Age pop art imagery in the listings, apparently going off all the time in the show itself, although very little video footage of it survives, as you may have noticed. Zocco himself, in this metaphor, was the Tharg the Mighty of the whole deal, the editor and host of the various cartoons and serials that he would introduce with a ping of his neon flippers and the words Zocco score 7 or whatever in the electronically processed voice of Radiophonic Workshop honcho Brian Hodgson. The second biggest innovation of Zocco, apart from the host of course, was that a lot, probably the majority of the material being linked, was a part of the show made by the BBC themselves for the exact purpose of being introduced by a sentient pinball table. There were still Republic serials and Disney material sold by the yard, but most of Zocco's material was original. There was Ali Bongo, the Shriek of Araby, a weekly pop video thing before they'd even been invented, and an all-original science fiction serial named Skane, apparently told by panning through massive comic panels drawn by Leslie Carwell. Zocco lasted a couple of seasons until 1970. Well, the show did. The pinball table didn't. By season 2, the show was being presented entirely by the pop art imagery. But it started the concept of Saturday morning as a specially cordoned off space for kids, beyond just throwing some kiddie programming on before grandstand. Yeah! 1973, over on the other side, saw the debut of something resembling the format we recognise today. LWT's Saturday Scene, while ostensibly a music show, gave us within that framework a lot of the elements Saturday mornings would come to embrace. Interviews, cartoons, live music, and a primordial version of the classic In the Round format, with a regular presenting team led by soon-to-be nationwide crush Sally James. Unfortunately, Saturday Scene, almost as little of which remains in the archives as does Zocco, which is why you're seeing the same footage over and over again, was victim to ITV's regional structure. There was no fixed national schedule, especially at who cares times of day like Saturday morning was at the time. Saturday Scene ran solely in its native London for 5 years. By the time it ended in 1977, ITV Saturday mornings were a patchwork across the nation, with most regions either showing the usual random films and cartoons, or increasingly buying up ATV's contribution from Birmingham, an undisciplined little programme called Today is Saturday, Watch and Smile, of which more shortly. LWT's immediate replacement for Saturday Scene was Our Show, a famously shoddy let's do the show right here in the barn type thing, hosted solely by stage school kids, which, as I'm sure you'll agree, is a brilliant idea. It did launch a few careers, but since Tim Whittle and Susan Tully are no longer names the general public really cares about, Our Show is now solely famous for this oft-repeated moment.
Now it's time for a break, but stay tuned, because we'll be talking to Andy Marriott, talking about the South African Grand Prix. Grand Prix! Yeah, Grand Prix! He's got here Grand Prix!
Our Show was broadcast in the LWT, Anglia and Southern regions for a couple of series. After that, there was one last roll of the dice in the form of the Saturday Banana, made by Southern and broadcast there and in London for 1.5 series starting in 1978. The story goes it was supposed to be the Saturday Bonanza, but someone read it wrong. Anyway, this was a likeable enough show in the Saturday Scene mould, according to anyone who remembers it, and Bill Oddie was a good choice of host for this sort of thing. But it didn't really catch on, apart from Metal Mickey, who made his debut here and unaccountably managed to bag a spin-off.
It has been a long time, Mr. Oddie.
Who are you?
I'm Metal Mickey.
What are you, if it comes to
Robots
that?
Robot.
Right, wait, hang on, wait a minute. I remember him.
An attempt at a second series of the Banana was ultimately scuppered by the apocalyptic 1979 strike, which murdered ITV itself for 3 months. So it was that in 1980, LWT and Southern finally bowed to the inevitable, as Anglia already had after Our Show died, and took on the show that was slowly taking over the nation. It started in 1974 as the brainchild of ATV presentation don Peter Tomlinson, initially as an in-vision continuity strand, the same principle as the Broom Cupboard more than a decade earlier. The initial hosts were various ITV faces, including John Asher, resplendent in Campaign for Real Ale t-shirt, Trevor East, Tomlinson himself, and an ATV newsreader named Chris Tarrant. For long it had moved into a corner of the colossal ATV Centre in Birmingham, where it would stay for the rest of its life. The show's budget in these early days was about 18 pence, so even after moving to the centre it tended to consist largely of just Tarrant and Asher ad-libbing like crazy while introducing the usual cartoons and films, holding the old phone-in competition, and tipping buckets of water all over passers-by. It was the latter part that proved the most popular with the child audience, or as Tarrant was wont to put it, this is what they want. On that basic understanding, a legend was gradually built. In 1977, viewers outside the Midlands got to see Tiswas for the first time, albeit only 10 minutes worth, on HTV in Wales and the West. The experiment clearly proved a success, as the following fourth season, a few months later, saw the dawning of the show's imperial phase. The budget was increased in anticipation of more regions joining in, and the team was expanded. With Saturday Scene now defunct, Sally James arrived in Birmingham and immediately became almost legendary, not to mention taking a starring role in the puberties of thousands. By the end of Series 4, Tiswas was running on Border, Anglia and Granada, as well as ATV and HTV, albeit still only for 10 minutes. And it kept growing. By 1978's fifth series, the legend was all but complete. John Gorman at the scaffold was established as a regular, as was mustachioed puppeteer Bob Carolgees, after what amounted to a successful on-screen addition. The Birmingham connection was kept strong by a hyperactive Dudleyite named Lenworth Henry, and surreal horror was provided by a Ken Campbell alumnus calling himself Sylvester McCoy. By season 6, Chris Tarrant was producer as well as presenter. The show was broadcast in full on every region bar Southern and Tyne-Tees, and the legend was all but complete. Tiswas' power came in the sense that the whole thing felt constantly like it was teetering on the edge of a cliff and could all come crashing down at any moment. Anarchy is an overused word when talking about it, but there's a reason for that. It was undisciplined, frequently to the point of being genuinely frightening. Genuine spontaneity is almost vanishingly rare, even from live television, and for obvious reasons. Tiswas was, and always will be, the greatest example of it. Once he became producer, Tarrant made a point of writing up a running order for the camera operators, and then completely disregarding it in the show itself. No gods, no masters. Literally anything could have happened, and often did. There was also a potent sense of menace about the whole enterprise, which is something kids love, as long as they're never actually in any real danger, hence the popularity of haunted houses and ghost trains and Halloween in general. The majority of celebrity guests brave enough to show up on Tiswas often ended up seeing out the show, if not spending the full 2 hours, in a tiny cage, having water, custard and shaving cream tipped all over them whenever there was some dead air, or if Tarrant was just bored. Eventually it reached a point where ATV, who generally regarded Tiswas with concern bordering on outright horror, finally stepped in and said the presenters weren't allowed to fling buckets of goop around anymore, as it set a bad example. Hence the creation of the Phantom Flanflinger as a proxy, and ultimately a mascot. This show might very well have been almost single-handedly responsible for the entire conception of the wet and messy fetish. Thanks, Tiswas. Southern and Tyne-Tees finally fell in 1980 and the conquest was complete. Admittedly, it never was broadcast on channel, but they're not even in the United Kingdom. Like Henry V, ITV had conquered a nation and were now the undisputed kings of Saturday mornings. Also like Henry V, it was to be an unexpectedly short reign. Meanwhile, over on the BBC, the other half of the Saturday morning equation was being put together. 1975 saw the debut of a little programme on Wednesday afternoons called Z Shed. The only visual evidence of it still in existence, as far as I can find, is this photo of the theme music on BBC records and tapes. It was basically a phone-in discussion programme for 10 to 15-year-olds, hosted by Radio 1 DJ and already Top of the Pops mainstay, Noel The Edmonds. It did okay, as evidenced by the fact that they released the theme music on record. and Edmonds knew a successful format when he saw one. Back then he did, anyway. And he also famously has an unstoppable urge to innovate, to do things with studio-bound and often live television that hadn't been done before. Again, that's become less of an advantage and more of a terrifying nightmare since his grip on sanity has loosened in the past 20 years, but never mind. Z-Shed lasted one season. In 1976, the nation beheld the multicoloured swap shop, Z-Shed writ large. Covering 2.5 uninterrupted hours at a time when only Grandstand dared to do similar. Noel held court behind his desk, with the late Keith Chegwin out in the field encouraging children to participate in an impromptu toy-based favour barter system. This was the burning core of the programme, the Swaporama, and an early example of Noel's genuine genius for pooling the BBC's resources. He only had one set of outside broadcast equipment at this point, and on Saturdays he was invariably being deployed at a football ground or a horse track or some damn thing for Grandstand, the programme that followed Swap Shop and took up all of Saturday afternoon on BBC One. Noel simply sent Cheggers to stage the Swaporama wherever the OB unit cameras were headed on Grandstand's behalf that week, creating one of the first regular non-sports related live outside broadcasts on British television without stretching the corporation's budget. Meanwhile, John Craven provided a weekend version of Newsround. Various stars in the music and children's TV firmament came in to submit to Noel's questioning, and at the centre of it all were the Z-Shed style phone-ins. Still a dizzyingly novel and modern concept at the time of Swap Shop's inception, when even Points of View's correspondence was almost exclusively by letter. To stretch such a thing out over 2.5 hours every week was both a massive risk and a massive unique selling point. Fortunately for Noel, it was an instant hit across the nation, and probably would have been even without its biggest advantage over Tiswas, that it was actually broadcast across the nation. At the time of Swap Shop's first series, the Tarrant-led monster was still only shown on ATV in the Midlands. As it slowly spread across the country like a highly infectious and supremely itchy rash, Swap Shop continued to hold its own, despite the miscalculation of having John Craven's newsy bit coincide with the start of the chaos on the other side. As the years went by, further innovations were added, like Maggie Philbin, a more wholesome nationwide crush than Sally James, and the purple dinosaur mascot Posh Paws. Swap Shop backwards. Well, very nearly. It looked a bit like Barney's cool older brother. There was Tony Hart taking drawing requests like a sort of primitive Google Images, and there was the entirely unseen Eric, who was credited for lowering down the plastic ball of competition entries every day. It was all much more civilised and ordered than Tiswas. Although both shows were entirely unscripted, Swap Shop did at least have a running order that was more than a cruel joke at the expense of the camera crew. As Tiswas conquered the ITV network, the country's kids split into two camps, which have been retrospectively defined along class lines, by behavioural psychology, by geography, by all sorts of things that I really can't be bothered with right now. Both shows came and went before I was born, but I can imagine myself being sometimes in a Tiswas mood and sometimes in a Swap Shop mood, and that's basically all there needs to be to it. Both shows were rich in what the other lacked. There was order and there was chaos. It was the Tao of Saturday morning. Nothing stays in perfect balance for long, however. Soon enough the order started to decay. No sooner had Tiswas conquered the entire nation in 1980 than the team started to break up. ATV and the IBA were increasingly wary of the excesses of the now thoroughly Tarrant-dominated show, especially with a looming franchise round in which ATV were one of the most vulnerable companies. After one wagging finger too many, Tarrant finally got sick and tired of it and announced that he was off, taking the bulk of the team with him. Gorman, Carol G's Henry, in a drastic amputation of the show's vital organs. Only Sally James remained behind, preferring her current job to Terence' big idea. If ATV had such a big problem with all the adult subtext in Tiswas, he'd just take it to late nights and convert it to outright text, with the help of his Tiswas cohorts, plus some sort of edgy alternative comic, for the coolty factor. The result was OTT, in both title and content. Helen Atkinson Wood replaced Sally James as Chief Lady, and the edgy alternative comic of choice was bullet-headed comic strip compare Alexei Sale, making his television debut. In a brilliantly efficient summing up of the entire show, Sale bailed out after a month or so, and his slot was taken by racist blob Bernard Manning. Suffice to say, it didn't do the nascent Central Television any favours. Turns out that when you take Tiswas, remove the limiting factor of the kiddie audience, but don't change the tone at all, what you end up with is more annoying than funny. It did provide the legendary Malcolm Hardy with some rare television exposure. I use the word with precision. But apart from that, its main legacy is as a massive cautionary tale. Still, it didn't harm anyone's career over much. Carol G's and Gorman returned to kids' television where they really belonged. Helen Atkinson Wood became a much-in-demand comic character actress. Lenny Henry ended up with a knighthood. Admittedly, Tarrant, the man in the centre of the whole mess, had to keep his head down television-wise for a bit. But he quickly got himself ensconced at Capital FM, where he stayed for 20 years, 17 of them on The Breakfast Show. And by the time he left that in 2004, he'd had at least 2 television comebacks and was dangerously close to national treasure status for Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. No, OTT did the most harm to his old parent show. Not just by removing almost the entire on-screen team at one fell stroke, although that probably would have been enough in itself to kill it off. With arch-anarchist Tarrant departed, opportunity knocked for the IBA and Central, the new holders of the Midlands franchise who'd originally spun out of ATV and inherited Tiswas in the process. Using the existence of OTT as an excuse, with the new show now supposedly providing the adult material, Central ordered the 8th series to skew as young as possible, with little to nothing of interest to anyone whose age was in double digits. Tarrant's replacement was the mustachioed Gordon Astley, plucked from Coventry local radio. Though a likeable chap, and you can't fault him for putting the effort in, he was ill-suited to the role. It's arguable that no one really could have done it justice. Astley certainly couldn't.
Hey, thanks, Sal. Yes, we're all raring to go as well here, aren't we, gang?
For his part, he saw himself as taking over Sally James's role, with Sally herself promoted to Tarrant's place. But no one else saw it that way. Sally and Gordon were assisted throughout the increasingly moribund final series by the likes of Den Hegarty, Clive Webb, and Fogwell Flax, crazy name, ultimately meaningless guy. With this watered-down lineup and under orders to keep the anarchy to a minimum, Tiswas started to atrophy, until by the end of Series 8 in 1981, the bought-in filler material in the shape of Warner Brothers' Popeye and Woody Woodpecker cartoons was starting to outnumber the studio bits. Tiswas was regressing back to its original form of a framing device for other people's material, because they'd lost both the talent and the freedom to make their own. At the end of the 8th series, Sally James decided to move on, and this was immediately seized upon as Central as an excuse to stop making it altogether. A year earlier, such a decision might have caused uproar. In the event, it was just a sensible burial of a show that had already died in spirit. Come the final episode in 1982, everyone knew it was Sally's last. Only a few suspected it was the last. Still, he got a surprisingly solid and even touching send-off.
Bonsoir, John. Prosit. Auf Wiedersehen. Au revoir. Adios. Aloha.
How do you like that? She didn't even say goodbye.
So you think this would be the perfect opportunity for Swap Shop to reign supreme and unopposed, right? Well, sure, except that by the time of Tiswas' last episode, Swap Shop had already ended the previous Saturday. Its death was less protracted than that of Tiswas, largely because the BBC were always happy with it and would have let it continue as long as Noel wanted to make it, as indeed they did. By 1982, the Edmonds feet were itchy for primetime glory. Keith Chegwin was already a headline star in his own right, and Maggie Philbin was being lined up for a Tomorrow's World gig. Besides, they had a honeymoon to plan. So the programme was efficiently wound up over the 6th and last season. The swap shop ceased trading on the 27th of March 1982, 1 week before Tiswas.
From the swap shop team, goodbye.
Like Tarrant before him, Noel immediately launched a conquest of the evenings, although with a couple of differences. He targeted prime time rather than late nights, and he was enormously, hideously successful, with a few blips.
This is BBC One. Because of the tragic accident involving Michael Lush,
until he finally lost pace with the tide of light entertainment in the late 90s and subsequently completely lost his mind, culminating in a series of comebacks on Sky and Channel 4 that leave you seriously and genuinely doubting his grip on sanity. It's surely only a matter of time before that brass eye sketch comes true. But never mind all that, what about Saturday mornings? They just lost both of their flagships within a week of each other. What are the kids of Britain going to do? Leave the house? Fortunately, help is at hand, in the form of a tiny lesbian Viking and a mop-topped fascist guitar hero.
Saturday, Saturday, Saturday is Tiswas Day. Saturday, Saturday, Saturday is Tiswas. Never a day to miss, 'cause Saturday is Tiswas Day. A Tiswas Day, so doesn't matter day. Fill the day with fun and have a laugh a day. Have yourself a